everybody. So one of the things that I'm often asked to do in my work designing effects for movies is to come up with things that you can't see, you can't film, that don't otherwise exist. And there's a very strong technical basis to the way that we work. We use a lot of technology in creating these images. But a lot of the time, the actual technology itself and the scientific process behind that doesn't necessarily inform the imagery that we make. The imagery we make is conjured up out of our imaginations. We make it up. But once in a while, you get an interesting project comes along where you get an opportunity to work in a different way. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So my story starts with this man. This is Professor Kip Thorne, who's a leading theoretical physicist. He is one of the people behind the recent discovery of gravitational waves earlier this year. And Kip had long had a dream of making a science fiction film that would have real science embedded at the heart of its story. He wanted to use the power of cinema to bring to a big mainstream audience some of the ideas in modern science and just show the audience just how outlandish and outrageous some of these ideas could actually be, just as crazy as anything you find in a big Hollywood blockbuster, if not even more so. But if there's one thing that's perhaps even more difficult than proving one of Einstein's most challenging theories, it's actually getting your green light for a $200 million science fiction film with a scientific basis. And so the project languished in development hell for several years until it was picked up by director Chris Nolan, who I've worked with for quite a few years on films such as The Dark Knight and more recently Inception. And Chris really loved the ideas in Kip's story. He thought that it was a great opportunity to explore and continue to explore themes that he'd already been examining in his films up to this point. And thus was born Interstellar. Now, Chris Nolan is a filmmaker who loves to put reality in front of the camera. If there's a practical way of achieving the images that we want to have in the film, he'll go and do it. Think of all the huge sets in the Dark Knight films or the amazing stunt work in the Inception movie. You know, these are real things that are happening in front of the camera. And if we can't film it, if it's something that isn't there, we're always going to try and find a way to ground it in some kind of observed reality. So very early on in pre-production on Interstellar, Chris said to me, it's really important that we get this, all the science in this film right. You're a scientist, go and speak to Kip Thorne and find out how this thing should look. Now, I'm not actually a scientist, I went to art school, and this is something that Chris forgets every time we make a film. But I've watched and read enough science fiction that I think I'm pretty well qualified for the job. So I went over to Kip Thorne's house in Pasadena, and I was a bit nervous about meeting Kip because his reputation as a physicist precedes him. And I thought I might come out looking a little bit ignorant about some of the things he was going to tell me about. But it turns out that Kip is an amazing communicator. And he took me through a lot of the really interesting concepts at the heart of Interstellar. And one of the things he showed me early on in our conversation was this drawing. And I said, well, I know what that is. That's a black hole. That's what a black hole looks like. It's a big hole in space. You go too near to it, you fall down it, down to the bottom, game over. And he said, no, that's wrong. This is not how a black hole looks in our universe. This is what is known as an embedded space diagram. It's physicists' shorthand for describing the extraordinary nature of this object, which is that what physicists do is, because we can't visualize more than 3 dimensions, physical dimensions in our minds, the physicists take the 3D universe and squash it down into a 2D sheet, and then you've got the spare dimension left over, and you can use that to represent higher dimensional space, the way that the black hole is affecting higher dimensional space. And I said, so what, you mean something like this is completely wrong? You know, this is the gold standard for imaging a black hole in a science fiction film. And he says, absolutely, it's completely wrong. A black hole is not a giant drain in space. You know, so unfortunately, the Disney film that I grew up with, which is one of the things that inspired me to get into my career, turns out not to be correct. I said, no, it's not a hole like that in space. It's a 3-dimensional hole in our 3-dimensional universe. It's actually a sphere. So I said, great. Okay, I went away and we came up with this drawing. This is a concept art, piece of concept art made by one of our artists at Double Negative. It's a spherical hole, we've got lots of stuff swirling into it. It looks pretty cool. I thought this was very exciting. We christened this the Christmas pudding image, with a little bit of flaming brandy on top of it. And I showed this to Kit and I said, well, so is this closer to the truth? And he said, no, you've left out one of the most important things. You've left out the gravitational lens. And I said, well, what's that? Massive objects like the sun warp space around them. And when light passes through that warped, curved space, it bends. Really massive objects like a black hole warp it a lot. And as the light beam gets closer to the black hole, it eventually goes into orbit around the black hole. And if it gets too close, it'll actually fall all the way in, never to be seen again. This is at the heart of the gravitational lens. Now, this isn't pure theory. This is a photograph of a real gravitational lens in space taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. The orange galaxy in the middle of the picture, its gravity is warping the space around it so that the image of the more distant blue galaxy is turning into this ring in the background. That's a gravitational lens. So I said to Kip, well, I think we all understand that. We understand lenses, we're filmmakers, we understand optics. Can you give us the maths behind this? And Kip said to me, one of the great quotes from making this film, the equations that you need are actually rather complicated. Which was one of the major understatements of my career, because the equations he's talking about, for the most part, came from this guy who's been talked about a lot tonight. The equations that govern the nature of the gravitational lens are in the theory of general relativity back in 1915. Now, in the usual course of things, in the development of a big Hollywood picture, this would be the point at which the filmmakers would say to the scientific advisor, thank you very much for your contribution, take his notes, chuck them in the bin, go off and make their own movie, which is explains some of the more implausible things that you find in, particularly in science fiction films. But Chris Nolan's stroke of genius was to actually send the visual effects department to go and to talk to Chris. And whilst I'm not a scientist, a lot of my colleagues are. We have people with PhDs in astrophysics and optics, computational fluid dynamics, engineering, computer science, all sorts of things. And our research and development team, led by Chief Scientist Oliver James, struck up a fantastic collaboration with Kip. And over the next few months, Kip sent us reams and reams and reams of scientific papers with advanced mathematics equations describing the nature of what we needed to do. Somewhere in here, and this is just a tiny sample, I think there were about 20 papers that he sent over, 30 or 40 pages long. And somewhere in here is the truth of the images that we wanted to create for our film. And over the next 6 months or so, Oliver and the R&D team at Double Negative were exchanging emails with Kip, who's based in Pasadena. Our team in London was exchanging emails with Kip on an hourly basis, day in, day out, week after week, month after month. And after about 6 months, they developed a new piece of software, which we called the Double Negative Gravitational Renderer, or DNGR for short. Now, a renderer, for those who don't know, a renderer is a piece of software which essentially draws the images of the things held inside the computer's memory. It's a key component of the modern visual effects pipeline. And here's a very early image from our DNGR renderer. You can see that the lensing is working, the background is swirling around the black hole. It's interesting, but it's not visually that compelling. And there's a big problem with this image that we're hiding here, which is that we've had to brighten the background universe dramatically to be able to see the black hole against it. That if we turn the stars down to what they should be, it would be pretty much a black cat in a coal scuttle moment. We wouldn't really see it. It's not especially dramatic. More importantly, we can't work out where we are in relation to the thing. We have no idea what our orientation is in relation to it, which is going to be very important to the storytelling, which after all is what we're all about. We're filmmakers. So we decided to add an extra component to the black hole called an accretion disk. Now, this is a belt of gas that's orbiting around the black hole, and as it swirls into the black hole, falls into the black hole's gravity, it heats up with friction and glows very, very brightly, giving off lots and lots of light. And it's kind of slightly contradictory that black holes are actually amongst some of the brightest things in the universe. They emit huge amounts of light and energy, lighting up whole galaxies in some cases. you can think of it a little bit like a sort of fiery version of the rings of Saturn around the planet. But what really gets interesting is when we start to apply the lensing to it, and the gravity of the black hole is so intense that the light from the far side of the accretion disk is warped over and under the black hole, eventually reaching the camera. So here's an early version of our accretion disk, a big sort of whirl of fire in space. We've made it very thin, and we've also made it relatively dim compared to some of the accretion disks that we know that are out there. And this is so we have a chance of actually seeing something else in the picture in our film. And it's okay, it's not that dramatic, but when we switch the lensing on, suddenly you get this much more exciting image. And the light from the accretion disk is warped into this beautiful halo around the black hole, which I often describe as being a sort of hellish version of the London Underground logo. And when I saw this animation, which came out very early on from the software, I began to think, we've got something pretty special going on here. And we actually took animations like this out onto the set. We were still filming the movie at the time that this was created. And rather than put green screens up outside the windows of the spacecraft set, we had huge projection screens and showed these images live on the set so we could film them. So when you see our cast looking at the black hole out of the window of the spacecraft, they're really looking at it. It was actually there on the day for them to film. And looking at these huge images swirling past on the screen, I began to think of things like the first time I saw this image. This is a painting called The Great Day of His Wrath by the 19th century painter John Martin. It's in the Tate Britain Gallery. And it has this overwhelming sense of drama and apocalypse. It's a dominant image, and I very much felt that the black hole was giving us that. It also made me think of modern art and the power of modern art. In particular, this piece by Olafur Eliasson, which is the Weather Project, which was in the Tate Modern Turbine Hall back in 2003, which is a very simple image, this huge disk of the glowing sun in the turbine hall, overpowering the space, dominating the environment. So DNGR gave us the ability to explore the environment around the black hole right up to the event horizon, the point at which light can no longer escape from the black hole's gravity. And it gave us some very, very compelling images, I think. What was really exciting from my point of view was also that we were art directing this a little bit. We were tweaking the colours, we added some lens flares to it to sit it in with the rest of the film. But for the most part, you're looking at Einstein's physics. They're driving the bus here. This is unadorned in that respect. And there was an unexpected benefit from creating the black hole in this unprecedented level of detail. We made this film for the IMAX format. This is an IMAX cinema. And IMAX has something like 10 times the resolution of a standard HD TV. And we were needing to create images at that level of detail. And nobody had ever really done this before. Nobody needed to in the scientific community. They'd not needed to create images for a big Hollywood IMAX film. And we found that our software was detailed enough to show us some really interesting effects at the edge of the black hole. As the black hole spins up to very nearly the speed of light, something we had to take into account, it wraps the space-time around it into increasingly convoluted shapes and refracts the background starlight through it in this extraordinary fashion, creating these almost like fingerprint filigree type images. And nobody had seen this before. So a combination of this, along with this discovery and the general techniques that we used to create the black hole, we were actually able to generate a couple of scientific papers on the back of this. We published in the Journal of Classical and Quantum Gravity. The editor told me that it was, to the best of his knowledge, the first time that a Hollywood movie had ever generated a scientific paper. And it was, it's an incredibly pleasing experience. And I guess I'm not the first person to draw the comparisons between art and science and see how that they're linked together, and I certainly won't be the last. But it strikes me that what we were doing, working with Kip, was revealing things that I had never expected to get. And the power of the tool sets that we have available to us now, both as scientists and as artists, are just amazing. The imagery that we can create, the places that we can go to, the things that we can explore in the virtual world in this case, are just amazing. And ultimately, I felt that we're all basically doing the same thing. We're all looking at different ways to understand the universe around us and to discover something about it, whether we're scientists, whether we're artists. We're revealing something about the universe that we're in. And that, to me, is a deeply essential creative urge. Thank you very much.